Okay, so when it comes to rendering, one really cool thing you can also do is to actually render volume. So I know that if you come more from a concept art background, painting background, typically clouds and stuff like that, you would use photos or paint them. But something I sometimes use, not always, are VDBs, like I just showed you. You can find plenty of them online, and you can render those in Redshift, doing what I'm doing here. So by creating a new Redshift volume with material, and then in the file slot, I'm just gonna plug in whatever VDB file that I have. So I just took one here, and it's gonna appear as this cubic bounding box in your viewport. And if I try to render this, you're not gonna see anything at first, and that is normal because it's a bit special, even though it's really easy to render VDBs inside of Redshift, and I'm gonna show you that in a second. It's gonna take a little while here for everything to process into the VRAM. There you go. Yeah, just switch off though the proxy so we can keep everything as light as possible. So as you can see, nothing shows up, and that is because you need to select your volume material that has been created when you created the volume with shader. And so let's select this. It's got to be somewhere around here. R is volume. There you go. This one. And what you need to do is to enable density here in the channel slot. If I now try to render this, now I should see something that is probably not going to be pretty, but it should be visible at the rendering. There you go. So in order for this to look a bit pretty, I'm just going to remap this, the new Mac, to something lower. And you want to play now mainly with two settings, which are the scattering coefficient and absorption coefficient. Now, what I want to achieve here is not like to have a super defined volume, far from it. For that, I would actually use photos, but for what I want to do here is more kind of a really diffuse mist. So I'm going to put really low values in those absorption and scatter coefficient values. I gotta say though that rendering volumes can be quite heavy. It depends. Here it still seems to be doing fine, but I'm gonna still just for the sake of showing this, putting the render settings to something quite low, just so it renders a bit faster. I'll explain the render settings just after, so don't worry. Okay, so let's see how this looks now. The values are still probably too high, I think, at this point. Yeah, so still want to diminish a lot the absorption coefficient. And to keep it simple, the more you diminish the absorption setting, the more transparent, I guess, the volume is gonna be, but also the more bright, and that you would control with the scattering setting. Usually I would say to do this kind of really diffuse mist, I would say that the scatter coefficient is just slightly higher than the absorption usually. Like for example here, 0.001 for absorption and 0.5 for scatter, which is way too high. So let's try 0.02, and I'm almost sure this should give me something quite close to what I want. There you go. So this is a lot more something like I would want for here. And this is quite a useful tool, I think, because we will have all those trees here, right? So I think it could be really nice to have some ground fog, and that will really make some silhouettes of those trees pop out. So I'm gonna probably just scatter 2 or 3 volumes. I don't need more, I think. So I'm gonna bring back here, sorry, my mesh instancers just to see how this looks. And notice how I try really to keep in the viewport and in the render only what I need. I'll just make everything show up for my final render, but otherwise I really like to keep everything as light as possible. I mean, Maya can handle quite heavy scenes, but you really gotta know how to manage them, I would say. Cool, so not too bad. We definitely need a bit more of those volumes, so I'm gonna keep playing with this a little bit until I have something that is cool. And by the way, when it comes to VDBs, you can find, so as I said, plenty of them online. And it can be clouds, it can also be smoke, it can be whatever that is a volume. Now let's see how this looks. Cool, so that is much better. I would say though that it's probably too desaturated for the moment. Ideally you wouldn't want those clouds this mist to be so gray. It would probably be a lot more bluish, or at least slightly more bluish like the sky, which would make sense. So I'm gonna tweak the scatter color that by default you can see it's really gray white here. So let's see if we can make this just a little bit more blue. And now you want to stop the render to do this because for some reason the swatches, color swatches don't work properly when the render is enabled sometimes. So let's see what we can do. Yeah, the scene is becoming slightly difficult to handle at this point. Okay, so this is way too saturated, so gotta be really subtle here, and this should do the trick. I'm not trying to get like a 200% perfect result because I will show that later, but you can always tweak the color and the intensity of this later on in post-production using this thing called AOVs or render passes. And this is what we're going to talk about in the next chapter actually. So I think we're pretty good for now for the AOV, for the volume, sorry. Gonna keep maybe just adding a few, but otherwise I think we can move on.